Most people think gold is an investment. That is the first mistake. They put it in the same mental drawer as stocks, rental property, private businesses, farmland, or bonds. They ask whether it produces cash flow. They ask whether it compounds. They ask whether it pays a yield. They ask whether it does anything. They ask whether it is dead money, barbarous, outdated, superstitious, or just a shiny relic people keep around because history is slow to die. I have never liked starting there because if you start there, you are already asking the wrong question. Gold is not important because it behaves like a productive asset. Gold is important because it exposes what your money really is. That is the line I want you to keep all the way through this story. Gold is not the story. Gold is the instrument that reveals the story. It is the ruler, it is the control sample, it is the thing that sits outside the promises and tells you whether the promises are still holding. That is the mother line for everything I am about to say. Gold is not a bet on excitement. Gold is a lie detector for money. Once you understand that, almost everything people say about gold starts sounding thin. The endless debate about whether it goes up. The lazy comparison to stocks, the little jokes about shiny rocks, the confident dismissal from people who believe modernity automatically made old truths irrelevant. Most of that noise exists because they are asking whether gold behaves like a machine designed to generate return. That is not what gold was chosen for. And that word matters, chosen, for 5,000 years. Across continents, empires, languages, religions, and political systems. Human beings kept returning to the same answer. Egyptians, Romans, Chinese dynasties, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, the great merchant civilizations, different gods, different armies, different legal codes, different clothes, same answer, gold. That should make any serious person pause. When a species keeps solving the same problem the same way for thousands of years, you should not sneer first. You should ask what the problem was and why the answer kept surviving. The problem was money. Not spending tokens, not accounting entries. Money, a durable store of value. A transferable claim across time. A thing that could outlive kings, storms, borders, collapses, and promises. And the reason gold kept surviving is because gold possesses something almost no government promise ever has for very long constraint. That is the first rule. Good money is defined less by what it can do and more by what cannot be done to it. That is the sentence people need to think about. What cannot be done to gold? It cannot be printed. It cannot be voted into abundance. It cannot be diluted by a cabinet meeting. It cannot be conjured by an emergency press conference on a Sunday night. It cannot be produced by political embarrassment and called relief. It has to be found, dug, refined, and held. That constraint is not a design flaw. It is the point. This is why the elemental story matters so much more than most people think. There are 118 elements on the periodic table. Humanity could have stumbled into many metals. Yet history kept selecting gold. Was that random? Was it mere vanity? Was it just shiny enough to seduce kings and jewelry makers into giving it a mystical premium? The answer is much colder and much more interesting. Gold is almost absurdly well suited to the monetary role. It does not corrode. It does not rust. It does not react to air or water in the way ordinary industrial metals do. A gold coin taken from a shipwreck centuries later is still recognizably gold. Try that with iron. Try that with copper. Those obey time much more quickly. Gold is divisible. You can melt it, cut it, shape it into coins, bars, flakes, wires, and sheets without destroying the thing that makes it itself. Gold is malleable. It can be worked, hammered, cast, standardized, weighted, assayed. And above all, gold is scarce. Not scarce in the political sense, scarce in the physical sense. It does not multiply because Parliament got nervous. That is what makes it monetary. Not merely beautiful, not merely old monetary. I call this the element test. The element test is the question every civilization ended up answering, whether the material chosen for money could preserve value across time, be divided without ruin, remain durable under stress, and resist sudden human multiplication. Gold passed. That is why it survived. Now let me give you a number that should reset your intuition. All the gold ever mined in human history, the pharaohs, the central banks, the wedding bands, the coins, the bars, the metals, the hidden reserves, the vaults, the smuggled hoards, all of it, if you melted it into one single cube, would fit into roughly 3.5 Olympic swimming pools. That is nothing. 8 billion people, 5,000 years of mining, 3.5 Olympic pools. If that fact lands properly, you begin understanding what scarcity really means. Not a category on a spreadsheet, not a slogan. A material reality so severe that all the accumulated gold of civilization remains physically finite enough to picture. That matters because it tells you something very deep. Gold was not chosen despite being hard to get. Gold was chosen because it was hard to get. That is the difference between money and political convenience. Political convenience wants elasticity. Money worthy of trust wants resistance. Now, once you understand why gold kept getting selected, the next question becomes unavoidable. If gold was money, what exactly is the dollar? What is the euro? What is the pound? What is the yen? What is the number in your bank account? That is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable. Because for most of human life, paper was not money in the modern sense. Paper was a receipt. That is all. It was a claim ticket, a convenience stand in a lighter object representing the heavier object elsewhere. And that distinction is one of the most important in all of financial history. A receipt is not the thing. A receipt is a claim on the thing. That sounds simple. But once governments and banking systems begin acting as though the receipt is just as good as the thing, and then better than the thing, and then no longer needs the thing at all, the whole moral structure of money changes. That is exactly what happened before 1971. The US dollar still carried the old memory of this structure, not perfectly, not innocently. The system had already become far more layered, more political, and more global than a village blacksmith storing coins. But the principles still existed. The dollar was tied to gold. Bretton Woods formalized the post-war version of this. Other currencies were tied to the dollar. The dollar was tied to gold at $35 an ounce. The whole world, in effect, sat on a hierarchy of claims anchored to one physical restraint that mattered, because restraint disciplines ambition, and governments do not love discipline when ambition grows expensive. So let us talk about what happened next. War programs, promises. Spending, the old formula. Vietnam cost money. The Great Society cost money. The United States wanted more than the gold discipline allowed it to finance cleanly. This is the second rule. Every fiat break begins with a state wanting more claims than the anchor can honestly support. That is not a moral accusation against one president or one party. It is a recurring temptation in political life. If the anchor is tight and power wants room, the anchor becomes the enemy. Other countries could see this tension too. They noticed the United States was issuing more dollar claims than seemed comfortable relative to the gold sitting behind those claims. And one country, France, was impolite enough to say out loud what others were thinking in private. We want the gold. Not your speeches, not your assurances, the gold. That is a very different kind of world from the one most people imagine today. A state had to think not only about what it wanted to spend, but about whether foreign holders of its currency might call its bluff. That was discipline. Then came the 15th of August, 1971. Richard Nixon goes on television and announces that the convertibility of the dollar into gold is being suspended. Temporarily, of course. Everything in politics that is permanent first introduces itself as temporary. But temporary lasted, the anchor was cut. The receipt no longer had to be redeemable in the thing it once represented. The paper was no longer a claim on gold. It became money, because the state said so. That was the moment the modern monetary psychology was born. I call it the anchor cut. The anchor cut is the break between money as a constrained claim on something outside the state and money as a state-backed promise whose main limit becomes political, well, rather than physical reserve. That is the real significance of 1971. Not just that a technical rule changed, that a civilization. Scale restraint was removed from the center of the monetary system, and when the anchor gets cut, the ship drifts. People do not always feel the drift immediately. That is what makes it so dangerous. At first, the transition can feel liberating: more flexibility, more room, more liquidity, more growth, more stimulus, more ability to respond, more capacity to paper over pressure. That is why fiat systems are politically attractive. They are not merely monetary arrangements, they are power multipliers, but the cost arrives eventually, because once the constraint is gone, the temptation never sleeps again. This is where people make a second mistake. They imagine inflation as if it were some mysterious weather pattern. Prices just went up, life got more expensive, something happened out there. Number that is not the deepest way to understand it. Inflation is not first the story of prices, it is first the story of claims. When more claims are issued against a limited world of real goods, services, labor, and assets, the claim unit buys less. That is what you are living through. Inflation is not mostly the grocery store becoming immoral. Inflation is the claim in your pocket weakening. The source document says this plainly and correctly. A 1971 dollar is worth roughly 7 cents in purchasing power today. That means the modern dollar lost more than 90% of its value over the fiat period. Gold did not go on some mystical moonshot. Gold simply remained closer to itself while the measuring stick around it shrank. Fe falecite fe turn 52 file 0 fe, that is the third rule. Gold does not mainly reveal its own rise. It reveals the decline of the measuring unit around it. This is why the Roman soldier example matters. A centurion 2,000 years ago could earn about an ounce of gold a month, and that ounce could buy a high-quality outfit, a serious outfit. Fast forward to the present, an ounce of gold still buys a serious outfit. Good suit, good shoes, good belt, good shirt, good tie. Gold did not magically perform. Gold preserved a purchasing relationship over vast time. It was the paper claims around it that moved. Fe file site fe turn 52 file 0 fe. I call this the centurion test. The centurion test asks whether a unit of value can preserve its purchasing character across long stretches of history rather than merely flashing higher in nominal terms when paper weakens. Gold passes that test, most currencies do not. That does not make gold productive in the ordinary sense. It makes gold stable in the deep sense, and people keep confusing those two things. They say, but gold does not yield anything, correct? A thermometer does not produce heat either. That does not make it useless. Gold is not a business. Gold is the control sample against which monetary dishonesty becomes visible. That is why the old phrase barbarous relic was always a little too clever for its own good. Gold looks primitive only to people who mistake complexity for trustworthiness. A central banking system with dozens of committees, spreadsheets, bond desks, emergency facilities, digital reserves, policy meetings, liquidity windows, and forward guidance sounds very modern. Fine, but if the end result is that savers get diluted year after year while the issuing state and leveraged asset owners are protected, then the sophistication has not solved the trust problem. It has only hidden it under better language. That is a very different thing. Now let me talk about why this matters to ordinary people, because the inflation story is not merely about consumer prices. It is about class. Once you move into a fiat system where claims can be expanded rapidly, the first-order winners are rarely savers sitting in cash. The winners tend to be borrowers and asset owners, people with debt against appreciating property, people with leverage against rising equity values, people close to newly issued claims. Institutions that can absorb the monetary expansion early. The losers are wage earners, cash savers, retirees living off nominal balances, and anyone whose claim on the future is denominated in a unit that is being diluted. This is why I say inflation is not a neutral tax. It is a wealth transfer. The source says this in stark terms. Money moves from savers to borrowers, from people holding cash to people holding assets, from the working class toward the asset-owning class. That is not a minor observation. That is the entire social politics of fiat monetary expansion condensed into one sentence. Fe falecite fe turn 52 file 0 fe. I call this the dilution funnel. The dilution funnel is the process through which newly expanded monetary claims reduce the purchasing power of existing cash balances while lifting the nominal value of assets, thereby shifting wealth toward owners and leveraged borrowers and away from savers and wage earners. That is what people mean when they say the system feels rigged. It is not always a conspiracy in the cartoon sense. It is architecture. If your wealth is stored in claims being diluted, you fall behind. If your wealth is stored in assets being repriced upward by the same dilution, you look richer. That is how a society can appear to get wealthier on paper while becoming more fragile in lived reality. A person with cash loses quietly. A person with houses, stocks, and leverage wins loudly. Then the culture turns around and pretends the winners were simply wiser. Sometimes they were, often they were just positioned closer to the spigot. Now let us come to the part the financial establishment does not enjoy talking about too much. Central banks and governments spent decades dismissing gold as archaic, obsolete, decorative. A pet rock for paranoid people. Yet what are central banks doing now? Buying gold not in trivial amounts, in massive amounts, record amounts. Poland, China, Turkey, India, Brazil, Kazakhstan, one central bank after another, quietly reallocating reserves toward the same asset their intellectual class spent years sneering at. Fay-Felicite Fay-Turn 52 File 0 Fay that contradiction matters, because institutions reveal their true beliefs not through speeches, but through balance sheet behavior. And their balance sheet behavior is saying something very clear. Gold still matters, not because the world is returning to horse carts and oil lamps, because sovereign actors can still tell the difference between a self-issued promise and a reserve asset. They do not need another country. Permission to trust. The source highlights 3 reasons for this surge, and they are exactly the right ones. First, de-dollarization. Countries want less dependence on the dollar system. Second, sanctions risk. If reserves held in somebody else's currency can be frozen, then those reserves are not as sovereign as you thought. Third, debt. Large reserve holders can read a debt trajectory chart just as well as anyone else. If the issuing state is adding $1 trillion in debt every 100 days, the holders of its currency are not irrational to seek ballast elsewhere. Fay-Felicite Fay-Turn 52 File 0. I call this reserve panic. Reserve panic is the shift by sovereign holders toward assets outside the direct control of foreign issuers, once trust in reserve currency. Neutrality, discipline, or long run purchasing integrity begins weakening. That is what central bank gold buying really is. Not nostalgia, not theater, insurance. Insurance against politicized reserves, insurance against dilution, insurance against the newspaper. Style decline. The source mentor describes so well the kind of decline that looks gradual for years and then suddenly obvious to everyone once the damage is no longer reversible. Fay-Felicite Fay-Turn 52 File 0 Fay, that newspaper analogy is a very useful one. A thing can decay for a long time while respectable people keep insisting it is fundamentally fine. That is how reputational systems die. Not by one dramatic overnight event, by the long erosion of trust followed by a fast public recognition that the trust had already gone. This is why gold matters now. Not because the dollar is disappearing tomorrow morning, not because you need apocalyptic fantasies to justify the case. Gold matters because the reserve architecture is no longer being treated with the old innocence, even by the institutions that benefited most from it. That should matter to you. Now, I need to say something clearly because this is where a lot of otherwise sensible people lose discipline. None of this means you should sell everything and buy gold. That is not what I am saying. That is not what the source is saying. Gold is not a complete financial life. Gold does not produce earnings. Gold does not replace businesses. Gold does not replace productive ownership. Gold does not replace a sensible equity allocation. Gold does not replace human skill. Gold does not replace all liquidity needs. Gold is monetary insurance, and insurance is supposed to be judged differently than growth assets. That distinction is vital. The source is careful about this and says it well. Physical gold and ETFs can form a foundation allocation, not a total worldview. Central banks, family offices, and sovereign funds often use ranges around 5 to 15%, depending on the overall structure and purpose of the portfolio. Not zero, not all. And that is exactly the right temperament. Fay file cite Fay turn 52 file, 0 Fay. The reason I respect that range is because it acknowledges two truths at once. First, gold is important. Second, gold is not enough. That is a mature sentence. Now let us talk about cash, because cash is where the quiet damage hides best. People think cash is safe. In the short term, yes. In nominal terms, yes. If your bank is sound and the currency is functioning, yes. But over long periods in a fiat order, cash is usually guaranteed to lose purchasing power. Guaranteed, not maybe. Guaranteed. That is why the source is right to say that cash is a slow bleed. People do not feel it day to day because the process is gradual, but they feel it all at once when they try to buy the house later, retire later, or preserve the standard of living later and discover that the numbers did not merely stand still, they decayed. Fay cite Fay turn 52 file 0 Fay. This is why I think modern savers are often making a category error. They are using cash as if it were long-term value storage when it is really better understood as short-term liquidity storage. Those are not the same purpose. Use the wrong tool for the wrong horizon and the system punishes you quietly enough that you may not notice until it is too late. That is the fourth rule. Cash is a parking place, not a long-term sanctuary. Gold, by contrast, is not a parking place for near-term spending. It is a reserve object. Again, the categories matter. Most financial mistakes begin when people stop naming the categories correctly. Now let me address the common objection from intelligent people who still resist all of this. They say, fine, perhaps gold preserves purchasing power over very long periods. Fine, perhaps fiat money loses purchasing power. Fine, perhaps central banks are buying gold. But none of that means the system is failing. It may only mean the system is evolving. Good. That is a fair objection. So let us answer it fairly. I do not need to claim total collapse to defend the role of gold. I do not need headlines about apocalypse. I do not need bunkers. I do not need melodrama. All I need is the truth that your currency has already lost over 90% of its purchasing power in the fiat era, that the issuing state continues piling on debt at a pace that would once have been unthinkable, that central banks are reallocating toward gold in record volumes, and that the broad culture still keeps telling ordinary people to think of cash as safety while the institutions closest to the system keep hedging against the very order they publicly defend. That is enough. That is a very serious set of facts without any need for fantasy. I call this the hypocrisy spread. The hypocrisy spread is the gap between what monetary authorities and mainstream finance rhetoric say about gold in public and what those same institutions reveal through their own reserve behavior in private. That spread is worth studying because hypocrisy is often the cleanest form of information. When a person mocks an asset with his mouth and buys it with his balance sheet, believe the balance sheet. Now let me tell you where I think the real value of understanding gold lies. It lies in unlearning naivety. That is more valuable than any specific percentage allocation. Once you understand gold, really understand it, you stop speaking about money the way children are taught to speak about money. You stop assuming the unit in your pocket is neutral. You stop assuming purchasing power decline as an unfortunate natural weather pattern. You stop assuming cash safety equals long-run value safety. You stop treating inflation as some technical inconvenience instead of what it so often is, a political redistribution mechanism. You stop imagining the state as a morally detached steward of money rather than as a power that will always be tempted to issue more claims when doing so solves immediate pressures for itself. That is a huge education, and it makes you harder to fool. The fifth rule is this. The greatest value of gold is not only in owning some, it is in understanding what your currency is not. That is the real pivot. Gold teaches by contrast. It teaches what it means for money to resist printing. It teaches what constraint looks like. It teaches what durability looks like. It teaches what it means for value not to depend on a press conference. And once you learn those lessons, you begin judging every monetary promise more intelligently that matters, even if you never buy a single coin. Now let me bring all of this down to the human level, where every serious monetary question eventually ends. Your savings, your purchasing power, your retirement. The source begins with a warning that the people who do not understand gold are the people who will be left wondering what happened to their savings, their purchasing power, and their retirement. That is not hysterical language. It is accurate, because savings can disappear without nominally disappearing. Purchasing power can be destroyed while the account statement still looks larger. A retirement account can rise in dollar terms while falling in real-life terms. Those are not contradictions. They are the everyday consequence of confusing paper growth with preserved value. Fe Philocite, Fe turn 52, file 0 Fe. That is the most important practical lesson here. You do not live in nominal life. You live in real life. You do not eat dollar statements. You eat food. You do not inhabit account balances. You inhabit shelter. You do not retire on percentages. You retire on what your claims can still command in the world. Gold has survived for so long not because it is dramatic, but because it forces that reality back into focus. It asks a simple question, not how many units do you have, what do the units still buy? That is a brutal question, and a necessary one. This is where the identity shift in the story really happens. Most people are trained to think like return chasers. I want you to think like monetary realists. A return chaser asks what asset might go up next. A monetary realist asks what unit is going down underneath everything else. A return chaser wants yield. A monetary realist wants purchasing integrity. A return chaser compares charts. A monetary realist compares claims against real things. That is the stronger mind. Not because growth does not matter, because growth without measurement integrity becomes illusion very quickly. And illusion is what ruins savers. So if I were compressing everything from this source into one final principle, it would be this. Gold is not the thing you buy because you worship the past. Gold is the thing you study, because it reveals how the present monetary order actually behaves. Study its properties, study its history, study 1971, study what central banks do when microphones are off and reserve decisions are made. Study what happened to the dollar's purchasing power after the anchor was cut. Study what inflation really transfers and to whom then decide what role. If any gold deserves in your own system, but whatever you do, do not remain naive. Naivety is the real luxury. Nobody can afford anymore. Gold has been sitting there for 5,000 years doing one job, telling the truth about paper promises. The question is not whether gold still matters. The question is whether you are willing to hear what it is saying.